There is a profound, almost dangerous arrogance in the modern mind when we look back across the vast expanse of human history. We sit within the comfortable, climate-controlled fortresses of the 21st century, surrounded by the invisible networks of global trade, digital finance, and instantaneous communication, and we convince ourselves that we are entirely unique. We believe that globalization, the intricate and fragile interdependence of distant nations, is an invention of the modern era, a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution and the silicon microchip. We look at the ancient world and imagine a fragmented, isolated landscape, populated by primitive kingdoms disconnected from one another, fighting localized wars with crude weapons in the dust. But the archaeological record, dug from the sands of Egypt, the ash of Anatolian highlands, and the crushing depths of the Mediterranean Sea, tells a completely different, deeply unsettling story. If you were to travel back to the 14th century before the Common Era, to the zenith of the late Bronze Age world, you would not find an isolated, primitive world. You would step into a highly sophisticated, deeply integrated, and hyper-globalized geopolitical system. It was a world order dominated by a cartel of superpower states that traded intimately, communicated constantly, and balanced upon a razor-thin edge of supply chain logistics. And, just like our own modern world, it was an incredibly complex system that eventually suffered a catastrophic, absolute, and apocalyptic systemic collapse. To understand the origins of international relations, statecraft, and the terrifying fragility of a globalized economy, we must dissect the rise and the spectacular fall of the late Bronze Age world order. To understand the geopolitics of this era, you must first understand the fundamental technology that drove it, the nuclear weapon and the silicon chip of the ancient world, bronze. Bronze was not just a metal, it was the definitive foundation of military supremacy and agricultural efficiency. The state that controlled the production of bronze controlled the ancient world. But the creation of bronze required a massive, continent-spanning logistical miracle. Bronze is an alloy, forged by smelting 90% copper with 10% tin. This seemingly simple metallurgical recipe created a geopolitical nightmare for the rulers of the ancient Near East, because while copper was relatively abundant, primarily mined in the massive industrial-scale pits on the island of Cyprus, known then as the Kingdom of Wallachia, tin was shockingly rare. There were no significant tin deposits in the eastern Mediterranean, in Egypt, or in Mesopotamia. To forge the weapons that sustained their empires, the great kings of the late Bronze Age had to import tin from the absolute fringes of the known world. The supply chains stretched thousands of miles eastward, originating in the treacherous, freezing altitudes of the Hindu Kush Mountains in modern-day Afghanistan. From those distant mines, the raw tin was loaded onto donkey caravans, traversing the unforgiving Iranian plateau, passing through the territory of Elam, descending into the bustling merchant hubs of Babylon and Assyria, before crossing the scorching Syrian desert to reach the wealthy, cosmopolitan port cities of the Levantine coast, such as Ugarit and Byblos. From there, it was loaded onto merchant galleys that hugged the rugged coastlines of Anatolia, distributing the vital metal to the arsenals of the great powers. The sheer scale and incredible wealth of this international trade network were frozen in time and miraculously preserved for over 3 millennia in the wreckage of a single doomed merchant vessel. Discovered in the early 1980s off the jagged southern coast of Turkey, the Uluburun shipwreck provides a breathtaking, physical snapshot of Bronze Age globalization. Dating to the late 14th century BC, the ship was a floating microcosm of the ancient world economy. When marine archaeologists carefully excavated the wreck, they pulled up a cargo of staggering geopolitical significance. The ship was carrying 10 tons of pure copper ingots from Cyprus, cast in the distinctive shape of ox hides for easy transport. Crucially, it was also carrying exactly 1 ton of tin ingots, perfectly matching the 10-to-1 ratio required to forge weapons-grade bronze. This single ship carried enough raw material to equip a small army with swords, spearheads, and armor. But the metal was only the foundation of the cargo. The ship was heavily laden with the luxury goods that greased the wheels of ancient diplomacy.
There were massive Canaanite jars filled with terebinth resin, used for incense and perfume. There were ingots of vibrant blue glass, destined to be carved into imitation lapis lazuli. There were logs of black ebony wood from the deep interior of Africa, elephant ivory, ostrich egg shells, and the delicate, beautifully painted pottery of the Mycenaean Greeks. The weapons found on board belonged to Mycenaeans, Canaanites, and Italians, suggesting a multi-ethnic crew of sailors, merchants, and mercenaries. The Uluburun ship was a testament to a world bound together by the relentless, driving need for resources, a world where the borders of empires were permeable to the flow of raw capital.
Presiding over this vast network of trade and resource extraction was an exclusive, highly structured geopolitical syndicate known to historians as the Great Powers Club. These were the superpowers of the Late Bronze Age, a collection of empires that dominated the Near East and the Eastern Mediterranean through military might, economic leverage, and a highly sophisticated system of diplomatic parity. The unquestioned hegemon of this club, the richest and most culturally prestigious power on earth, was the new kingdom of Egypt. Egypt's geopolitical strategy was defined by its unique, hyper-defensible geography. Bounded by the impassable Sahara to the west, the harsh eastern desert to the east, and the cataracts of the Nile to the south, the Egyptian core was virtually impregnable. The Nile River itself provided a brutally predictable, highly centralized agricultural surplus, allowing the pharaohs to maintain a massive, rigidly organized state bureaucracy and a formidable standing army. But Egypt's true geopolitical leverage, the absolute foundation of its international power, was gold. The pharaohs controlled the vast, seemingly inexhaustible gold mines of Nubia, located in modern-day Sudan. In a world before minted coinage, gold was the ultimate diplomatic currency, and Egypt had a monopoly. They used this immense wealth to buy the compliance of lesser states, to fund monumental construction projects that projected an aura of divine invincibility, and to heavily influence the internal politics of their rival superpowers. To the north, dominating the harsh, mountainous terrain of central Anatolia, was the antithesis of Egypt, the Hittite Empire, known to the ancients as Hatti. If Egypt was a power built on gold and geographical isolation, the Hittite Empire was a power built on iron discipline, legal administration, and the world's most terrifying military machine. The Anatolian plateau was rugged, prone to severe winters, and lacking the predictable agricultural abundance of the Nile or the Mesopotamian river valleys. Consequently, the Hittite state was born out of conflict and forged in a state of perpetual insecurity. They developed a highly militarized, deeply pragmatic culture. They were pioneers in the use of the heavy three-man chariot, a massive shock combat weapons platform designed not just for mobile archery, but for violently crashing into and shattering enemy infantry lines. The Hittites were expansionist by necessity, constantly pushing south through the passes of the Taurus Mountains to secure control over the vital trade routes of northern Syria, putting them on a direct collision course with the geopolitical ambitions of Egypt.
Sitting dangerously between the Hittites and the Egyptians, in the fertile crescent of northern Mesopotamia and Syria, was the Hurrian kingdom of Mitanni. Ruled by a shadowy elite of Indo-Aryan chariot warriors, Mitanni was, for a time, the preeminent military power in the Near East. They were the undisputed masters of horsemanship and light chariot warfare, utilizing highly mobile, rapidly redeploying forces that could outmaneuver the heavier, slower armies of their rivals. At their height, the kings of Mitanni held the strategic high ground of the ancient world, controlling the vital trade arteries that linked the Mediterranean Sea to the distant markets of the East. However, Mitanni's geography was its ultimate curse. Lacking natural defensible borders, they were surrounded by aggressive, expansionist predators. They were engaged in a desperate, multi-front war of attrition, caught in a permanent geopolitical vice between the creeping influence of Egypt from the south and the relentless hammering assaults of the Hittites from the north. Further east, situated in the ancient, deeply venerated alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia, was Kassite Babylon. Babylon was the elder statesman of the Great Powers Club. While it lacked the overwhelming kinetic military striking power of the Hittites or the boundless liquid wealth of the Egyptians, Babylon wielded something equally potent: absolute cultural and intellectual hegemony. Babylon was the Paris or the Oxford of the Late Bronze Age. It was the center of scientific, mathematical, and astronomical innovation. Its scribal schools set the curriculum for the entire civilized world. The language of Babylon, Akkadian, written in intricate cuneiform wedges on clay tablets, was the undisputed lingua franca of international diplomacy. Even when the pharaoh of Egypt wrote to the king of the Hittites, neither used their own native tongue. They communicated using the Babylonian language, a testament to the immense, enduring soft power of the Kassite dynasty. Babylon functioned as the massive, wealthy anchor of the eastern trade routes, an essential economic hub that absorbed the luxury goods of the West and funneled the vital tin of the East into the global supply chain. Yet, lurking on the northern fringes of Babylon, growing stronger with every passing generation, was the dark horse of the Late Bronze Age, the Middle Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were a hardened, austere, and ruthlessly militaristic society, born in the exposed, highly vulnerable plains of the upper Tigris River. They were surrounded by hostile ale tribes and competing empires, which ingrained in them a national psychology of preemptive strike and absolute, unyielding aggression. As the power of Mitanni began to wane under the pressure of Hittite invasions, the Assyrians sensed weakness and violently exploded onto the international stage. They shattered the remnants of the Mitannian state, absorbed their territories, and integrated their chariot technology into their own brutally efficient military apparatus. The rise of Assyria sent shockwaves through the geopolitical architecture of the Near East, forcing the older, more established superpowers to fundamentally recalculate their strategic alliances. The Assyrians did not care for the established norms of diplomatic courtesy. They were a rising, hungry hegemon, driven by an ideology of continuous, divinely mandated conquest, viewing the expansion of their borders as a religious obligation to their patron god, Ashur. The complex, paranoid, and highly transactional relationships between these empires are not a matter of historical speculation. They are documented with shocking, granular clarity in the Amarna letters. Discovered in the ruins of the short-lived Egyptian capital of Akhetaten, built by the radical, sun-worshipping pharaoh Akhenaten, the Amarna archive consists of over 300 clay tablets containing the actual, highly classified diplomatic correspondence of the great kings. Reading the Amarna letters is like intercepting the private communications of modern geopolitical rivals. The language is draped in the heavy, formalized protocols of ancient diplomacy, but beneath the polite phrasing lies a ruthless, calculating, and often incredibly petty reality. The great kings referred to one another as brother, establishing an exclusive peer-to-peer relationship that structurally excluded the rulers of minor, subjugated states, whom they referred to simply as servants.
The letters reveal a world utterly obsessed with the concept of parity, the exchange of luxury gifts, and the strategic deployment of royal women through dynastic marriage. The kings constantly negotiated massive transnational marriages, sending their daughters across the known world to seal alliances. Yet these marriages were deeply asymmetrical. While the kings of Babylon, Mitanni, and Hatti willingly send their princesses to the Egyptian harem, the pharaohs absolutely refused to reciprocate, maintaining a strict policy of cultural superiority, stating bluntly that an Egyptian princess had never been given to a foreigner. But the primary obsession of the Amarna correspondence was gold. The letters from Babylon and Mitanni are filled with endless, almost desperate pleas for Egyptian gold. The king of Mitanni writes to the pharaoh, casually mentioning a marriage alliance before aggressively demanding more gold, claiming that in Egypt, gold is as common as dust. When a shipment of gold arrives in Babylon and is found to be alloyed with base metals, the Babylonian king writes a scathing, deeply insulted letter, accusing the pharaoh of diplomatic fraud and threatening to sever trade relations. Beyond the petty squabbles over wealth, the Amarna letters expose the brutal reality of imperialism in the Levant, the narrow strip of land comprising modern-day Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. The Levant was the geopolitical shatter belt of the ancient world. It was an incredibly wealthy region, dotted with prosperous, independent maritime city-states like Byblos, Tyre, and Sidon, which controlled the flow of timber, purple dye, and maritime trade.
But it was also the indispensable buffer zone between the Egyptian Empire to the south and the Hittite Empire to the north. Consequently, the city-states of the Levant were heavily subjugated, forced into a state of permanent, degrading vassalage. The Amarna archive is filled with frantic, terrified letters from the mayors of these Canaanite cities, begging the pharaoh for military reinforcements to protect them from the encroaching Hittite armies, or from the Habiru, bands of stateless, nomadic mercenaries and outlaws who were destabilizing the countryside. The Egyptian response was often cold, calculated, and terrifyingly indifferent. The pharaohs viewed the Levant not as a territory to be developed, but as an extraction zone to be squeezed for tribute, and a strategic depth to absorb enemy invasions before they could reach the borders of Egypt itself. While the land-based empires of the Near East engaged in this intricate, high-stakes game of diplomatic chess, the western periphery of the Bronze Age world was dominated by a completely different breed of power, the naval thalassocracies of the Aegean Sea. For centuries, the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean had been the Minoans, a vibrant, highly advanced civilization based on the island of Crete. The Minoans were an anomaly in the violent landscape of the ancient world. Their massive, labyrinthine palatial centers, such as Knossos, were entirely unfortified. They did not build defensive walls because they did not need them. Their defense was their overwhelming absolute supremacy at sea. The Minoans possessed a massive fleet of sleek, heavily timbered galleys that controlled the maritime trade routes, effectively turning the Aegean into a heavily policed, exclusive economic zone. They exported high-end luxury goods, intricate jewelry, exquisitely dyed textiles, and highly sought-after olive oil, deeply integrating themselves into the economies of Egypt and the Levant.
But geopolitical power is inherently transient, and by the 15th century BC, the Minoan hegemony was brutally shattered. The massive, apocalyptic volcanic eruption of the island of Thera sent devastating tsunamis crashing into the northern coast of Crete, crippling the Minoan fleet and devastating their coastal infrastructure. Seizing upon this catastrophic vulnerability, a new, far more aggressive power descended from the rugged mainland of Greece, the Mycenaeans. The Mycenaeans were a martial, hyper-masculine, and deeply violent society, the very people whose exploits would later be mythologized by Homer in the Iliad. Unlike the open, unfortified palaces of the Minoans, the Mycenaeans ruled from massive, heavily fortified citadels like Mycenae and Tiryns, perched on high, defensible hills and surrounded by colossal, cyclopean stone walls, reflecting a deeply ingrained paranoia and a constant state of internal warfare. The Mycenaeans aggressively filled the power vacuum left by the Minoans. They took over the Aegean trade networks, pushing their merchant fleets eastward, violently establishing footholds on the coast of Anatolia, and engaging in a complex, multi-layered relationship with the Hittite Empire. In the Hittite diplomatic archives, there are numerous, highly anxious references to a power in the west called the Ahiawa, widely believed by modern scholars to be the Hittite term for the Achaeans or the Mycenaean Greeks. The Ahiawa were the ultimate rogue state of the Bronze Age. They were too far away for the Hittites to conquer, yet powerful enough to constantly destabilize the Anatolian coast. They funded proxy rebellions, harbored fugitives from Hittite justice, and engaged in state-sponsored piracy, raiding the highly vulnerable merchant shipping that carried the vital copper and tin supply chains. The Mycenaeans operated on the predatory fringes of the civilized world, acting simultaneously as indispensable trading partners, highly valued heavy infantry mercenaries, and terrifying maritime raiders. This intensely competitive, hyper-militarized world order inevitably required a release valve. The mounting geopolitical friction between the great land empires, driven by the absolute necessity to control the vital trade corridors of the Levant, culminated in the year 1274 BC in what stands as the largest chariot battle in human history, the Battle of Kadesh. This was not a border skirmish. It was a massive, all-or-nothing collision of superpowers. Ramesses II, the young, fiercely ambitious, and deeply arrogant pharaoh of Egypt, mobilized an unprecedented army of 20,000 men, divided into 4 massive divisions named after the gods Amun, Re, Ptah, and Set. His objective was to march north deep into modern-day Syria and recapture the strategic vassal state of Amurru from the Hittites. Amurru was the geopolitical linchpin of the northern Levant. Controlling it meant controlling the lucrative coastal trade and establishing a staging ground for a direct invasion of the Hittite homeland. Waiting for Ramesses in the north was the Hittite king, Muwatalli II, a seasoned, deeply cunning, and utterly ruthless strategic commander.
Muwatalli understood that fighting the Egyptians in a straight, grinding battle of attrition was incredibly dangerous, so he opted for a masterpiece of military deception. As the Egyptian army approached the fortress city of Kadesh, situated on the banks of the Orontes River, Ramses' intelligence officers captured 2 Bedouin nomads who claimed that the Hittite army was terrified of the pharaoh and had retreated hundreds of miles to the north. Driven by overwhelming hubris and a desperate desire for personal glory, Ramses believed the disinformation. He dangerously accelerated his march, severely overextending his supply lines and utterly separating his lead division, the Amun, from the rest of his army.
It was a fatal, catastrophic mistake. The Bedouins were double agents. The entire Hittite army, an unprecedented coalition of 40,000 infantry and 3,000 heavily armored 3-man chariots, was not hundreds of miles away. They were hidden in absolute silence, directly behind the massive tell of the city of Kadesh. As Ramses made camp, unaware of the impending doom, the Hittite chariotry unleashed a devastating, coordinated ambush. They exploded from their concealed positions, smashing violently into the flank of the fiercely marching Re division, utterly shattering it in minutes. The Hittite heavy chariots then wheeled and crashed into the unprepared Egyptian camp, initiating a desperate, horrific slaughter. Ramses was completely surrounded, facing the total, unmitigated annihilation of his army and the potential collapse of the Egyptian state. According to Egyptian propaganda, Ramses single-handedly charged into the Hittite ranks, a divine warrior king slaying thousands. The tactical reality was much darker and far more desperate. Ramses was saved only by the sudden, highly fortunate arrival of an elite allied mercenary force from the coast, known as the Niren, who slammed into the rear of the Hittite chariots, breaking the encirclement and allowing the surviving Egyptian forces to regroup. The heavy Hittite chariots, devastating in a sudden ambush, proved sluggish and highly vulnerable in a protracted close-quarters melee against the lighter, far more maneuverable 2-man Egyptian chariots. The battle descended into a horrific, blood-soaked stalemate, with thousands of men and horses drowning in the mud of the Orontes River. When the sun set on the killing fields of Kadesh, both empires had stared directly into the abyss of total military collapse. Ramses had survived, but his army was severely mauled, incapable of taking the city, and forced into a long, humiliating retreat back to Egypt. Muwatalli held the ground, retaining control of Amuru, but he had lost a massive portion of his highly trained, irreplaceable chariot elite. The Battle of Kadesh was a profound geopolitical reality check. Both Ramses and the Hittite leadership realized that neither side possessed the logistical capability or the overwhelming force required to achieve total, absolute victory over the other. The war dragged on in localized skirmishes for another decade, draining the treasuries and the manpower of both empires, until a far more terrifying threat forced them to the negotiating table. The aggressive, rapidly expanding Assyrian Empire had conquered the remnants of Mitanni and was now pushing violently against the eastern borders of the Hittite state. Facing a catastrophic two-front war, the new Hittite king, Hattusili III, reached out to his lifelong enemy, Ramses II. In 1258 BC, the two superpowers ratified the Treaty of Kadesh, the first comprehensively documented bilateral peace treaty in human history. Engraved on silver tablets and ratified by 1,000 gods from both empires, the treaty was a masterpiece of cold, calculating geopolitical pragmatism. It established a definitive mutual border in the Levant, guaranteed a mutual defense pact against internal rebellions and external invasions, clearly aimed at the rising Assyrian threat, and stipulated the extradition of political refugees. To seal the pact, Ramses married a Hittite princess, elevating her to the status of great royal wife. The international system had reached its absolute zenith. Peace, forged in the fires of mutual exhaustion and strategic necessity, reigned over the Near East. The trade routes were secure. The copper and tin flowed uninterrupted. The great cities grew richer, their palaces filled with unprecedented wealth. It appeared to be the dawn of a permanent, unshakable golden age. Yet, underneath the glittering surface of diplomatic marriages and massive gold shipments, the very foundation of the late Bronze Age world was rotting. The geopolitical system had become hyper-coherent. The empires were so deeply interconnected, so fundamentally reliant on the uninterrupted flow of long-distance trade, that they had unknowingly sacrificed resilience for efficiency. Their massive, heavily centralized palatial economies were incredibly rigid, strictly controlled by a top-heavy, bloated bureaucracy that aggressively collected agricultural surplus and redistributed it to the military elite and the specialized artisan class.
This system functioned flawlessly during times of abundance, but it possessed absolutely zero elasticity. It was a brittle, precarious architecture of power, highly vulnerable to even the slightest systemic shock. And in the early decades of the 12th century BC, the shocks began to arrive, not as a single, easily identifiable enemy, but as a cascading, multifaceted environmental and geopolitical apocalypse. The primary catalyst for the collapse was deeply environmental. Modern paleoclimatology, utilizing pollen core data extracted from the Sea of Galilee, the coastal lagoons of Cyprus, and the deep caves of the Peloponnese, has definitively proven that the eastern Mediterranean was suddenly gripped by a severe, prolonged, and devastating megadrought. The rains simply stopped falling. The reliable, seasonal patterns of precipitation that had sustained the dry farming agriculture of Anatolia, Greece, and the Levant failed violently and repeatedly over a period of decades. The resulting famine was absolute and utterly terrifying. The massive, centralized bureaucracies of the Hittites and the Mycenaeans, built entirely on the premise of collecting and distributing massive grain surpluses, completely broke down. They could no longer feed their sprawling populations, their vast standing armies, or their bloated administrative classes. The Hittite diplomatic archives from this period are filled with an overwhelming, desperate sense of panic. A letter from the Hittite king to the ruler of Ugarit violently demands a massive shipment of grain, stating with chilling clarity, "It is a matter of life and death." We even have records of the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah, honoring the old peace treaty, sending massive shipments of grain to Anatolia, desperately trying to artificially prop up the starving Hittite state to prevent the total collapse of the northern buffer zone. Simultaneously, the Earth itself seemed to turn against the empires of the Bronze Age. Archaeoseismology has revealed that the eastern Mediterranean sits upon a highly volatile network of fault lines. In the late 13th and early 12th centuries BC, this region suffered what geologists call an earthquake storm, a prolonged series of massive, devastating seismic events, where the unzipping of one fault line triggers a cascading series of violent earthquakes along adjacent faults. The great, heavily fortified citadels of the Mycenaeans, the wealthy, sprawling port cities of the Levant, and the monumental capital of the Hittites were repeatedly struck and severely damaged by these tremors, severely crippling their defensive infrastructure and utterly exhausting their economic reserves as they desperately attempted to rebuild. It is within this terrifying context of prolonged, starving droughts, shattered cities, and collapsing central authority that we must understand the phenomenon of the Sea Peoples. For decades, popular history has portrayed the Sea Peoples as a massive, unified, and highly organized naval armada, a coalition of bloodthirsty barbarians who swept across the Mediterranean and violently destroyed the civilized world. But the reality is far more complex, far more tragic, and far more recognizable to the modern geopolitical mind. The Sea Peoples were not the cause of the Bronze Age collapse. They were the ultimate, devastating symptom of it. They were a massive, chaotic, and heavily armed migration of desperate, starving, displaced populations. As the agricultural systems of the Aegean, the Balkans, and Western Anatolia failed, the rigid palatial states violently collapsed inward. The populations of these regions, facing absolute starvation, had no choice but to migrate. They took to the sea in massive, improvised flotillas, bringing their women, their children, and their belongings in ox-drawn tarts. Among them were heavily armed, highly lethal groups of mercenary soldiers, former Mycenaean heavy infantry, and displaced Anatolian raiders, groups the Egyptians named the Peliset, the Teker, the Shekelesh, the Shardana, and the Danuna.
This was not a coordinated military invasion. It was a cascading, violent wave of human desperation slamming into a deeply weakened, hyper-fragile geopolitical network. As these displaced populations moved southward along the coast of the eastern Mediterranean, they acted as a violent catalyst, triggering opportunistic uprisings and internal rebellions within the starving, heavily subjugated vassal states of the Levant. The great cities of the trade network fell like dominoes. The fate of Ugarit, the wealthiest, most vital port city of the Bronze Age, serves as the ultimate chilling microcosm of the collapse. In the final, dying days of the city, King Hammurabi of Ugarit wrote a desperate, panicked letter to the king of Cyprus. The clay tablet, found hastily baked in the fires that ultimately destroyed the city, reads, "My father, behold, the enemy's ships came, my cities were burned, and they did evil things in my country.
Does not my father know that all my troops and chariots are in the Hittite country, and all my ships are in the land of Lycia? Thus the country is abandoned to itself. May my father know it. The 7 ships of the enemy that came here inflicted much damage upon us. Amurapi was begging a dead man for help. Cyprus was already burning. The Hittite Empire, starving, its armies deeply overextended and its supply lines utterly severed, violently disintegrated, its monumental capital of Hattusa abandoned to the ash. The massive, deeply integrated system of globalization violently ripped itself apart. The tin stopped flowing, the bronze could no longer be forged, the ancient world was plunged into a dark age. Only Egypt, shielded by its isolated geography and its highly centralized absolute authority, managed to survive the violent storm, but the cost was utterly catastrophic. In the year 1177 BC, Pharaoh Ramesses III mobilized every remaining asset of the Egyptian state to confront the massive, desperate coalition of the Sea Peoples as they descended upon the Nile Delta. The Great Harris Papyrus and the massive, deeply unsettling reliefs carved into the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu document a horrific, desperate battle for national survival. The Egyptians did not fight a civilized war of chariot maneuvers. They fought a brutal, close-quarters war of extermination in the muddy swamps of the delta. The Egyptian archers unleashed devastating, continuous volleys of arrows from the shores, while their galleys violently rammed and capsized the improvised ships of the migrants, turning the Nile waters red. Ramesses III achieved a complete tactical victory, proudly declaring that he had thrown the invaders back into the sea and enslaved the survivors. But it was the ultimate fatal Pyrrhic victory. Egypt had survived, but it was fundamentally broken. The immense wealth of the state had been completely exhausted in the desperate defense. The international trade networks that had supplied Egypt with tin, copper, and tin were completely gone. The great empires of the north, their vital trading partners and their diplomatic equals, were nothing more than smoking ruins. Stripped of its geopolitical leverage, cut off from the global economy, and severely weakened internally, the new kingdom of Egypt slowly, agonizingly withered away, collapsing into a long, bitter period of internal division and foreign domination.
The collapse of the late Bronze Age world order is the most profound, terrifying, and deeply relevant geopolitical lesson in human history. When the dust finally settled on the ruins of the 12th century BC, an oppressive, suffocating silence fell over the eastern Mediterranean. The highly sophisticated, deeply integrated world of the Amarna letters vanished entirely. The complex, intricate systems of cuneiform and Mycenaean linear B writing were completely lost, effectively erasing the ability to record history, administration, or poetry for centuries. The population plummeted, trade ceased entirely, and the survivors scattered into small, isolated, heavily fortified mountaintop villages, terrified of the sea that had brought their destruction. They were forced to abandon the massive, beautiful bronze weapons of their ancestors, turning instead to a much cruder, far more difficult to forge, but locally abundant metal out of sheer, absolute necessity: iron. The Iron Age did not begin as an era of technological triumph. It began as an era of desperate, post-apocalyptic scavenging, born from the violent death of the tin trade. The hubris of the great kings, their belief in the absolute permanence of their heavily centralized, hyper-globalized systems, was buried beneath the ash of their burning cities. They failed to understand that the very complexity that made their empires incredibly wealthy also made them incredibly fragile. They learned, at the cost of their entire civilization, that when power is built upon an overly optimized, deeply interdependent supply chain, the failure of a single critical node does not cause a localized crisis. It triggers an absolute, cascading, and uncontrollable collapse of the entire world.